Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. Okay, so we are a couple weeks out from the release of the PlayStation 5 and Miles Morales Spider-Man. Spider-Man Miles Morales, I guess is what they're calling it, whatever it is, the Spider-Man 2 game. And here's the thing, okay, I'm actually kind of sad about this. Myself and Mariah have not pre-ordered, like we didn't get a chance to pre-order the PS5, right? Like the pre-orders were out like that, like it was insane. So here's the deal. Are there any members of the Rob Corps in Columbus, Ohio that can hook up myself and Mariah with PlayStation 5? Right, I'll give you like an extra $200 plus the cost of the PlayStation 5s if you can hook us up. That would be awesome, right? That'd be super cool. If you can, send me an email, rob@comicsexplained.com. That would be amazing. I don't know if any of you guys can. We'll even go as far as Cleveland if we have to, but that'd be awesome if you guys could, right? So it's been a little while since we covered Miles Morales, right? We covered the first two, and I think we did it like 3 years ago. So we're gonna do a little bit of catch up here for people who are really uncertain and who are kind of lagging behind in the midst of all this. So Miles Morales becoming Spider-Man came out of what was basically like Cataclysm to a degree, right? It was basically this great big huge story arc in the Ultimate Universe where that version of Spider-Man had died, right? So a little bit of explanation here. The Ultimate Universe was launched in 2000, and it was the answer to the question, what would it look like if superheroes existed in the real world, right? A more modern depiction of superheroes as we know them in Marvel Comics. The Ultimate Universe was hugely popular, and it was basically launched with Ultimate Spider-Man, right? With Peter Parker. Now, when Peter Parker died, Spider-Man fans were pissed, right? They were so mad because they loved that version of Spider-Man. And as we know, as comic book fans, we don't really like it when things change, right? We like things to stay the same forever and ever and ever, because when things are different, it takes us getting used to it again, and we just don't want to have to go through all that. You know, we're old people, right? We just get stuck in our ways. And the result of this is that when Miles Morales initially came onto the scene, there was a lot of hate for the character of Miles. The funny thing is, he's hugely popular now. So much so that, like, one, he's got his own game, and two, I've heard nothing but people being excited about the new Miles Morales game, right? So as with most things in comics, give it time and you may end up finding that you like it. But the whole thing behind this is that in the early days and kind of in the beginning of this, Miles Morales, having been bitten by a spider that gave him radioactive powers in much the same way that Peter Parker did, was met with a lot of backlash in the Ultimate Comics universe, right? Like in the actual comics themselves, because Peter Parker had like just died. And then Miles, you know, in order to honor the memory of Peter, went out and got a Spider-Man suit and then was like, okay, let's be Spider-Man, right? And he was met by like Nick Fury, he was met by Jessica Drew or whatever you want to call her, basically the Ultimate Universe version of Spider-Girl, Spider-Woman, and they were kind of like, you can't do this, right? Like you're disrespecting the memory of Peter. But the reality was that Miles believed that he was honoring the memory of Peter, right? Like he believed he was doing the right thing. And so ultimately he ended up getting the blessing of Nick Fury, and then this led to the introduction of the Prowler, right? And the Prowler was a character who had already been around, and the Prowler was basically the uncle of Miles Morales. He was basically Aaron, right? And the idea behind this was that you ended up having Miles basically allying himself with Aaron as part of Aaron's request. Now, when Miles started realizing that things were a little sketchy here, that's when all this kind of started popping off, right? But this really is kind of like when the two of them first start teaming up. We as the reader knew that Aaron was a bad guy, right? Like we knew he was basically a villain. He was one of the most wanted men in the United States, and in fact, he was wanted by Interpol and the FBI, right? Like it was a huge deal. Again, it's probably one of the best thieves, if not the best thief in the entirety of the Ultimate Universe. He was kind of a big deal. Now, with him and Miles teaming up for the first time, this involves them going after a guy by the name of Scorpion. In Marvel, in the Ultimate Universe, you had two versions of the Scorpion character, and you're probably familiar with him from like maybe Spider-Man, the animated series back in the 90s, or comic books, or whatever the case is. But the Scorpion that you initially saw in Ultimate Comics was part of the Ultimate Universe line of the Clone Saga, right? Like cloning Peter Parker. That's where, you know, the Jessica character came from and so on. But the Scorpion was a clone of Peter Parker, right? So that was kind of like that version that we saw. I wouldn't go as far as to say he was hugely popular. I honestly didn't really enjoy the whole concept, but the thing about this is that this version of Scorpion that we see here is the guy who's actually named Maximus Gargan, right? So his name is almost identical to the one from the main Marvel Universe, Max Gargan. The difference here is that unlike Mac Gargan in the main Marvel Universe, who's just a guy who's a criminal, in the Ultimate Universe, Maximus Gargan was basically a Mexican crime lord, is essentially what he was. He was like a Mexican drug kingpin, but he was working for Prowler. And so essentially you had this kind of exchange that was supposed to go on between the two of them. But basically Maximus Gargan ended up turning on the Prowler. It led into a great big huge fight. Prowler basically got out of there. And then Maximus has come here to New York City in order to make himself a kingpin. And because of the fact that he was able to overcome Prowler before, the indication is he can do it again, right? So he's not too worried about the Prowler's character. But that's why they're here, is because Aaron is trying to get rid of Maximus, or trying to get rid of Scorpion, because Scorpion's encroaching on his turf. The idea that he's pitching to Miles Morales is he's a bad guy, right? So we got to get rid of bad guys. So he's essentially using Miles' desire to be a hero in order to effectively turn Miles into his own enforcer, is really kind of what's happening here. But Scorpion showing up here and just being like, okay, so like, you know, this is my spot now, right? Like, I'm taking over this. Like, I was a guy who operated in Mexico, that's true, but like, now I want to swim with the bigger fish, right? And so I'm taking the entirety of New York over. I'm going to become its new kingpin. The funny thing about this is that he's immediately met by Aaron, right? He's immediately met by the Prowler, and in turn, the Prowler's like, okay, so like, you gotta go, right? You gotta go. Now, the response of Scorpion is like, you still owe me payment, right? Like, you still owe me for our last deal that went down. Technically, that's true. That when that deal initially went down, that Aaron was the one who refused to live up to his end of the bargain. Now, he did so under the auspices that Scorpion tried to double cross him, right? And saying like, you forfeited your share of this whole thing when you tried to double cross me, but technically a deal is a deal. And so the result of this is that, you know, Scorpion's here to kind of call in his end and take out the Prowler if he can, and then take over New York himself. Now, of course, this leads to Spider-Man jumping in. Now, there are questions that you're most likely asking here, right? Where are characters like Daredevil or like Luke Cage or Heroes for Hire or any of the number of ground level heroes that we see in New York that could easily respond to a threat like this? The reality of the Ultimate Universe, guys, is that it was designed to be a far more stripped down version of the main Marvel Universe. The main Marvel Universe, just to give you perspective, had like thousands of mutants who had appeared over the course of Marvel's publication history, and those are the ones that they focused on for any real measure of time. When you take into account the one-offs, the ones who appeared for like a single story, then you're starting to get into the hundreds of thousands, right? There were just, you know, so many different mutants that had appeared. And so you take that and you expand it to like the almost never-ending roster of Avengers. You add in things like the Midnight Suns, right? You add in like, you know, Doctor Strange's Black Ops Defenders team from like the 1990s, right? They carried out like all these secret missions and things like that. It was super cool. It was an awesome concept. It was terribly executed, but it was an awesome concept. But you take all these things and you throwing it in, and what you end up in the main Marvel Universe, you end up with this just hugely expansive landscape of heroes, and it's insanely difficult to keep up with it all. The Ultimate Universe wanted to correct that, right? So you have like the Ultimates, you've got the Fantastic Four, you've got the X-Men, you got Spider-Man, and that's basically it, right? You see other characters kind of pop in and out, but you weren't really seeing like Ultimate Comics Blade, right? You weren't really seeing that. You weren't really seeing like Ultimate Comics Werewolf by Night. You weren't really seeing any of that stuff, right? Any of like these characters that would have been interesting to see. Instead, it was designed to be super closed down. I would say that overall, in terms of individual publications, right? Individual comic book lines, I think you may be capped out at 20 comics over the course of the Ultimate Universe's lifespan. And I'd say that's probably about it, if that, right? It was very, 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 very small. Seeing other characters would happen in other characters' comics, things like that, right? So just one of the, you know, kind of an answer to that question, you know, why don't we see a lot more going on here? Because it's not designed to be overly huge, right? It's one of the great things about the Ultimate Universe. But of course, this is when things pop off. Basically, you know, everybody pulls guns blazing, shots firing, everything's going all to pieces. Now, this is when we kind of get reminded a little bit of the Scorpion's powers, right? And make sure you guys check down in the description, just kind of a reminder, make sure you check down in the description. You'll find Ultimate Spider-Man, really the first two videos that we did, volumes 1 and 2. You'll find that down there so you can get caught up and you won't feel like you're just kind of flying in out of nowhere. But the idea behind Scorpion is that he has enhanced durability and enhanced strength. Now, he's not completely invulnerable, and he doesn't have like superhuman strength, right? Where he's like equal to the Incredible Hulk in strength or anything like that. He's just kind of got enhanced abilities, but they're enough to where he can easily hold his own against like, you know, being shot at or being stabbed or something along those lines, right? So he doesn't really have Luke Cage's skin, but something reasonably close to it. The other part of this is that given his enhanced abilities, he also is able to go toe to toe with Miles Morales. But the reason why this happens is because Miles is still learning about his powers, right? He's still learning what he's capable of. Now, a lot of Miles' ability to expand beyond his existing horizons will actually come in the first Spider-Man story, which we will cover. That's basically, it was really cool. It was when Bendis basically told all the Miles Morales haters to shut up when they were like, he can't, he's not really Spider-Man. Bendis literally wrote a story where Peter Parker from the main Marvel Universe and Miles Morales from the Ultimate Universe, and Peter Parker's like, who cares what the world says? I think you're a great Spider-Man, go forward, right? And it's basically Bendis saying, hey, I know you guys, some of you guys out there don't like Miles Morales, tough luck. And then just like continuing to write the story. It was amazing. It was a hilarious response to the haters. But the funny thing about this is that Miles is learning his powers. And so when it comes to somebody like Peter, right, if we look at like even the Ultimate Universe comics version of Spider-Man Peter Parker, or you look at the main Marvel Universe version of Spider-Man Peter Parker, the important thing is that in the early days, he had his learning, he had his process where he learned his powers, but as time went on, it started to become second nature, to where he could just react and instinctively know what he needs to do. You know, that's one of the things that kind of came out of Dan Slott's run, is when he was talking about why Spider-Man would crack jokes all the time. Because where you kind of looked at it and saw Spider-Man as almost kind of a nonsensical character, you know, when he was engaging in fights and didn't really seem to be taking it seriously, the reason why he would crack jokes is because he wanted to make the villains think he wasn't taking them seriously, and that in turn would piss them off. And the angrier they got, the less focused they became, and the easier it would be for Peter Parker to take them out. That's one of the things that he kind of learned over the course of his time as Spider-Man. With Miles Morales, it'll be much the same way. That as we cover these comics, you'll quite literally see Miles become better at being Spider-Man. But in these early comics here, in this third volume of his original run, he doesn't really know what he's doing. He doesn't really have any official training. And that's really what he was told by Nick Fury. When Nick Fury sanctioned him as being Spider-Man, he's like, you're on your own to figure out how to be a superhero. We're not going to train you, right? We're not going to give you like official training, at least not at the moment. We're not going to do any of that, right? Like, you just got to become the best version of Spider-Man that you can on your own. And if you really are meant to be a great Spider-Man, then you will become one. If not, then you'll probably suck and you'll probably end up getting killed. Best of luck. And that was basically it. It was kind of a dick move. But, you know, ultimately, one of the things that Miles ends up doing is underestimating Scorpion, right? In the sense that he's able to overcome him for a minute. And where Aaron wants to get his revenge on Scorpion, the response of Miles is, no, it's one thing to stop a criminal, it's another to go out of your way and try to kill the guy, right? Like, that's not going to do anybody any good. And ultimately, Miles ends up intending to kind of walk away. Now, Scorpion wakes up, Scorpion attacks Miles goes invisible, he attacks Scorpion again, and then when Miles turns his back, Scorpion gets away. And so it's one of these things where he's constantly underestimating the villains that he faces off against. But that's because he simply hasn't learned that you have to make sure that they're knocked out, right? Like, you know, that's one of the things that Peter kind of learned, right, as time went on, that like as he would face off against different villains, he would realize just because they look like they're knocked out doesn't mean they are, right? You gotta pummel them a few extra times, right? You gotta, you know, smack them around a little bit more than you normally would, and then, you know, then they'll be knocked out, and that'll basically be it. You know, you gotta slap them around a bit is kind of what Peter Parker would do. But of course, this leads to of course, you know, Miles Morales tracking down Scorpion, going to attack him again, and then using his Venom Blast, right, to essentially incapacitate him. This kind of Venom Shock ability that he has to incapacitate Scorpion, and then handing Scorpion over to the cops. Now, the response to the police officers is to initially try to arrest Miles Morales, and that is the way his comics were in the early days, right? And it wasn't really like a racial thing. It wasn't like he's wearing a black Spider-Man costume, obviously he's black, get him. It wasn't necessarily like that. It was this idea that they didn't know him. Like when Peter Parker first showed up on the scene, in a lot of ways it was kind of a welcoming thing. Now, a lot of that was because of the fact that it was Spider-Man, right? And nobody wants to really read comics where the world hates Spider-Man. And then two, because it was kind of the launch of the Ultimate Universe, right? So it was designed to be kind of a celebratory run, you know, this kind of celebratory inaugural run in Peter. Now, he did run into a whole bunch of problems, and there were times when society was kind of like, you know, but nonetheless, you know, with Miles Morales, in a lot of ways, the writing, how the cops are depicted here is designed to kind of depict the naysayers, right? In the sense that he's not Spider-Man, we don't really know what's going on here, but get rid of him. You know, he's not legit. And so as a result of that, of course, he makes himself invisible and ends up taking off, right? Ends up, you know, kind of going back to where Aaron and them were, looking to find Aaron, and Aaron basically disappeared. Now, the next day, you end up getting Miles meeting up with Genki, right? Meeting up with Genki Lee. The two of them kind of talking, you know, and he's like, dude, you busted like Maximus, right? You busted the Scorpion, like he's this huge thing. And then that's when he starts talking to his Uncle Aaron, and his Uncle Aaron's like, he's like, where'd you go? He's like, I'm gonna go get some rest. Are you okay? And you know, it's like, okay, like we're just getting started, right? Like we're gonna get back to this again. And Miles' initial idea is, no, like I don't want to be involved in this, right? And that's when Aaron kind of breaks out that blackmail card in the sense of like, I wanted, like, then maybe I should hit up your dad, right? Maybe I should tell your dad what's going on. Now, that's a little bit of backstory that we haven't really explained yet. The idea was that Aaron, of course, has kind of always been a criminal his whole life. It started out with him just kind of getting into mischief when he was younger, and then graduating into, you know, more intense and more, not really violent, but more serious crimes. The father of Miles was involved in that to a degree, but eventually went his own separate way, right? He kind of went, you know, basically went on the right path, kind of corrected himself and got himself into a better place. The result of this is that the father of Miles does not like Aaron, and he does not want Aaron to have any involvement in Miles' life, and he's made that clear to Miles, right? Like, do do not spend time with your uncle. He's a bad guy, right? Like, he's a criminal. Like, if you follow him, like, he will get you into trouble. He doesn't care about anybody. He doesn't care about anything. If he leads you to believe that he cares about you, it's because he's duping you, right? Like, he's using you for his own ends. And so that's one of the things that kind of went on here, is that Miles knew he wasn't really supposed to be spending time with Aaron, but he has been anyway. The other part of this is that Miles' parents don't know anything about his powers, right? They don't know that he's Spider-Man. And so he's kind of trying to keep this secret from them. Now, it's one of these things where Aaron knows this and then uses it against him and says, well, I mean, we can go in there right now, right? When Miles meets him later on, he's like, we can go in there right now and I can just tell them everything that's going on. Miles' response is, no, fine, like, I'll meet with you the same place as last time. And so when the two of them end up meeting up together, Miles shows up and says, this is not gonna happen. You're like, I'll tell my parents if I need to, but here's what's gonna go on. You're gonna leave town, right? Like, you are really a bad person. You're every bit as bad as my dad said you were, right? Like, you really don't care about anybody but yourself. Like, you don't come near me, you don't come near my parents, right? Now, this was important for Miles. This was a hugely important moment for Miles Morales. And the reason why is because for his character, the way he was originally written, he wasn't necessarily a people pleaser, but he had this desire to connect with his uncle Aaron. And the fact that he was able to connect to a degree, even when he was younger and he spent time with him, knowing that he wasn't necessarily supposed to, you know, in this moment right now, spending time with his uncle Aaron and trying to get to know him on a more personal level is compounded and made difficult by the fact that Aaron really is a bad guy. And so coming to him with Miles Morales being largely a character who lacked a lot of confidence in himself, right? Who lacked confidence in himself, what he was capable of and what he could achieve, to in turn come along and to go against somebody like the Prowler, who, despite not having the powers of Spider-Man, is wildly capable of going toe to toe with one. He's basically saying, like, you're gonna leave here, right? Like, you're gonna leave this town. You're never gonna talk to me or my parents again, you know. And it's one of these things where Prowler's like, fine, like, if you want to play with the big boys, then you got to be ready. And then he in turn attacks Miles Morales. And this is not easy fight for Miles, right? Using a combination of all of his gadgetry, his sonics, all those things at his disposal, he's able to kind of get the upper hand on Miles. But one of the important things here is that Miles starts to gain more confidence in his abilities and begins to use his powers in the way that he's supposed to, right? Making himself invisible, using sneak attack, using subtlety, different things like that. And that's one of the important things to understand, is that when it comes to someone like Miles, what he lacks in experience, he makes up for in powers that Peter Parker simply just didn't have. Peter Parker did not have a venom blast. He could not make himself invisible, right? And so, you know, with Miles, the fact that he's still learning how to fight, this actually bends itself to his favor, right? Instead of being something that can just enhance his existing abilities, it can help him compensate for his lack of experience, right? Making himself invisible and then coming back around again. And so he's able to kind of get the upper hand on Aaron and actually ends up damaging one of his gloves, right? One of his power gloves. And when that happens, of course, the fight ends up leading down into the street, where basically there's almost like this massive wreck or this city bus, you know, kind of topples over when Aaron ends up blasting it, right, with his gloves. And that's really when Miles begins to get the bigger picture that Aaron really doesn't care about anybody but himself, that he really is a tried and true villain. And this is also significant because one of the biggest issues that Miles had is he had this desire to inherently see the good in everybody. And while that's not necessarily a bad thing, that kind of naivety can really cause you problems later on down the line, right? The belief that people are inherently good, and if they end up doing bad things, it's because they were in a rough spot, but they want to become good people. That can cost lives. And that's what Miles is learning here, that Aaron isn't a guy who was just down on his luck and ended up in a bad spot and there's a way to reach him and turn him back into a good guy. He's just a bad person. And the fact that he's willing to, like, endanger the lives of a busload of people in order to get the upper hand in a fight against Miles Morales really shows the kind of person that he is. And so at that point, Miles Morales starts cutting loose, right? He starts letting loose, and it's just like, fine. Like if that's how we're gonna fight, then let's fight. This is gonna be a knockdown, drag out fight. He uses his venom blast, starts literally hitting Aaron from every direction and getting the upper hand. The problem with this is that in a split second, Aaron gets the upper hand on Miles and goes to attack him and seemingly does it with the intention of killing him. The problem with this is the previous attack by Miles that damaged his glove ends up coming home to roost when the whole thing explodes, right? It's like a bomb going off. And when that happens, it kills Aaron, right? It looks like it kills Aaron. And so it's just kind of like the last little word that Miles gets here from Aaron is like, look at that, right? You're just like me. You don't care who you kill as long as you come out on top. It's just this crushing response to Miles effectively getting his uncle killed, or seemingly getting his uncle killed. With that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comments Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.